You've done it before. You said something maybe at work, maybe to a friend, maybe in an argument with someone who barely deserved your time. And then, before they could even respond, you started explaining. I didn't mean it like that. What I was trying to say was, you have to understand the context, and somewhere in the middle of that explanation, there was a flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible moment where you felt it, the shift in power. You were no longer speaking, you were justifying, and the other person, whether they knew it consciously or not, felt it too. Machiavelli noticed this 500 years ago. Not in the polished, philosophical language of Plato, not in the moral framework of Aristotle, but in the raw, uncomfortable observation of how people actually work, how leaders rise and fall, how respect is built and destroyed, how a man who explains himself too often becomes, in the eyes of others, a man who does not fully believe in himself. That sounds harsh. It's meant to, because what we're talking about today isn't about being cold or dismissive or emotionally unavailable. It's about something more precise than that. The psychology of justification. Why we do it, what it signals, and what it quietly costs us every time we reach for it as a tool. Here's the thing about explaining yourself. It feels like strength. It feels like clarity. Like respect, like maturity. I am communicating. I am being transparent. I am treating you like an intelligent adult who deserves to understand my reasoning. But Machiavelli would tell you that how something feels and what it actually does are two very different things. And the evidence, not just from history, but from modern psychology, suggests he was right. So, let's sit with the uncomfortable version of this question. Not, when is it okay to explain yourself? But rather, what does it mean that you felt the need to explain in the first place? Every explanation has a structure. It begins with an implied acknowledgement. I believe you may not understand or may not approve of what I have said or done. Then it moves to a correction. Let me fix that. And it ends, almost always, with an appeal. Now that you understand, please don't judge me the way you were about to. That's what an explanation actually is. Underneath the logic, underneath the detail, underneath the sincerity, it is an appeal. And appeals, by their nature, require a power imbalance. You don't appeal upward to gravity. You don't explain yourself to a chair. The act of justification presupposes that the person you're justifying to has something you want: approval, understanding, absolution, continued respect, and that they have the power to withhold it. Machiavelli understood this intuitively. In The Prince, he writes with a kind of clinical detachment about how perception shapes power, not how things are, but how they appear to be. And what he observed, watching rulers across Europe rise and fall, was that the ones who explained themselves too readily always revealed the same thing. They were uncertain whether they deserved what they had. That's the buried mechanism of justification. It's not about the logic, it's about the signal. When you over-explain, you are, whether you intend to or not, broadcasting a message. You are saying, your opinion of me matters enough that I need to manage it actively. And in certain contexts, that's fine. In most human relationships, that's normal. But the moment you do it reflexively, compulsively, as a default response to any friction or misunderstanding, something changes in how others read you. Psychologists call this the over-justification effect, though that term usually refers to motivation and rewards. But there's a social parallel that's just as real. When a person explains themselves beyond what the situation requires, observers unconsciously begin to discount not just the explanation, but the person giving it. The excess reveals anxiety, and anxiety signals doubt. Think about the leaders or people in your own life you found most compelling, not necessarily the ones you liked the most. Compelling and likable are different things, but the ones who made you feel that they had a kind of settled, unshakable sense of themselves. Did they explain? Not often, or not much. When they did, it was brief, and then it was done. They didn't circle back. They didn't add caveats. They didn't monitor your face to see if you'd accepted the explanation. They said what they said, and then they moved. That composure isn't indifference. It's not arrogance. It's something more specific. A quiet confidence that their position doesn't require your validation to be legitimate. And because they behaved that way, you found yourself, without quite realizing it, granting them legitimacy. This is what Machiavelli saw. Not that explaining is always wrong, but that there is a threshold. And once you cross it, the explanation itself becomes the problem, regardless of the content. Because the content stopped mattering the moment you revealed that you needed to give it. The question isn't whether you were right. The question is why your rightness required defending. Here is something Machiavelli wrote that most people find unsettling when they first encounter it directly. He argued that a prince should appear virtuous, merciful, faithful, honest, religious, but that it is not necessary and often harmful to actually be all of these things in all circumstances. What matters, Machiavelli says, is the appearance, the perception, the theater. That sounds like pure cynicism, but it's pointing at something psychological that modern research has actually confirmed. People do not primarily evaluate others based on facts. They evaluate based on patterns of behavior, emotional signals, and, crucially, what your behavior implies about how you see yourself. This is why explaining yourself can backfire even when you're completely right. Let's say you make a decision, at work, in a relationship, anywhere, and someone challenges it. You explain your reasoning patiently and thoroughly. The explanation is correct. The logic is sound. The other person nods. But here is what has also happened. They have watched you spend significant energy caring whether they agreed with you, and their brain has filed that away, not as a judgment necessarily, not as something they'd articulate, but as a data point, a pattern. This person needs to be understood. This person gets uncomfortable when questioned. This person's choices feel more provisional than decisive. This is what Machiavelli called the danger of appearing uncertain. Not being uncertain, appearing uncertain. Because in the theater of social life, appearance is what others have to work with. Robert Cialdini, the psychologist, best known for his work on influence and persuasion, documented something related in his research on social proof and authority. People attribute leadership qualities not to what someone says, but to how they carry what they say. Hesitation, overqualification, and especially self-justification all function as signals of low status, even when the content itself is confident. This isn't about performing false confidence. That has its own tells. It's about something quieter. The difference between a person who speaks from a place of internal settlement and a person who speaks from a place of hoping they'll be accepted. Machiavelli saw this play out at the highest levels of political power in Renaissance Italy. Rulers who begged for loyalty rarely kept it. Those who commanded it, not through cruelty necessarily, but through a kind of unruffled certainty, created something in the people around them that explanation never could. The assumption of authority. There's a modern behavioral economics concept called the confidence heuristic. We don't have enough information to evaluate most claims accurately, so we use confidence as a proxy. The more self-assured someone appears, the more we tend to believe their claim is worth taking seriously. The problem, of course, is that confidence can be performed, and often is. Machiavelli knew that. He didn't recommend being confident because it necessarily reflects the truth. He recommended it because that is how the world actually works. And here is the part that should sit uncomfortably with you. If you have spent your life believing that thorough, sincere explanation earns you trust, you may have been optimizing for something that the people around you weren't actually rewarding. They were watching something else entirely. Let's talk about the specific kinds of explaining that cost the most. There is a difference between explaining out of generosity, sharing context because it genuinely helps the other person understand a complex situation, and explaining out of anxiety, where the real driver isn't their understanding, but your relief. Most of us confuse these constantly. We tell ourselves we're being generous when we are, in fact, managing our own discomfort. Machiavelli would draw the line here. He wasn't opposed to communication. He wasn't advocating for stonewalling or cruelty. He was observing that there is a mode of speaking in which the speaker's need becomes more visible than their message, and that mode is almost always a form of vulnerability that the listener will, consciously or not, catalog. Psychologists call this self-disclosure vulnerability. There's a therapeutic context where it's healthy and essential. And then there's the social context, professional relationships, hierarchies, adversarial negotiations, where the same disclosure functions very differently. It becomes information. Information about where you can be pressed. Think about arguments, real ones, not healthy discussions, the kind where something is actually at stake. The person who explains the most is almost never the one who wins. Not because explanation is logically weak, but because explanation in a conflict is a concession. It says, I need you to see my side, and the moment you need something from someone in a dispute, the dynamic has shifted. You have given them something to withhold. You have handed them leverage without them asking for it. This is why Machiavelli's most enduring advice isn't really about strategy. It's about desire. Specifically, the fewer things you visibly need from others, the less power they have over you. And what you need most, often without realizing it, is to be understood. The compulsive explainer is someone whose deepest fear is being misread. And because they fear it so intensely, they explain loudly, thoroughly, repeatedly, in a way that ensures everyone around them can see exactly how much it matters that they be understood correctly, which of course gives everyone around them the map to exactly where they're vulnerable. There's a social phenomenon worth noting here. The people who explain themselves the least tend to be explained about the most by others. They become subjects of interpretation, projection, curiosity. There is something magnetic about a person who doesn't feel the need to constantly account for themselves, not because they're mysterious, but because they appear self-contained in a way that most people don't manage. Machiavelli understood this as a function of power, but it's really a function of psychology. We are drawn to what doesn't require our approval to exist. We are unnerved by what seems entirely independent of our opinion, and we are, whether we like it or not, slightly less interested in, and slightly more dismissive of, those who need our understanding in order to feel okay. This isn't fair. It isn't morally clean. It's just true. And the question it opens up, the one you probably don't want to sit with, is this: how much of your explaining has been about clarity, and how much has been about fear? There's a reason Machiavelli makes people uncomfortable 500 years after he wrote. It's not that he was wrong. It's that he was right about things we prefer to believe aren't true. We want to believe that explaining ourselves builds connection, earns trust, demonstrates respect. And sometimes it does. That's not the lie. The lie is the always. The assumption that explanation is inherently virtuous. That more transparency is always better. That sincerity, particularly when offered unprompted in defense of a decision someone didn't ask you to defend, is always strength. What Machiavelli observed, and what the psychology consistently confirms, is that the impulse to explain is often indistinguishable from the impulse to seek permission, and that we live in a world where most people, most of the time, will not consciously grant or deny that permission, but they will respond to whether you seem to need it. This doesn't mean you should become cold. It doesn't mean you should stop communicating, or close off, or adopt some performance of imperviousness. Those are answers that don't fit the question. The question is subtler than that. It's about what you're actually doing when you explain. Whether you're offering clarity to someone who needs it, or whether you're managing your own fear of being judged and calling it honesty because it feels better that way. Machiavelli never told his readers to stop caring what others thought. He told them to stop showing that they cared. And embedded in that advice is something worth turning over carefully, because it's more complicated than it first appears. Because if the only reason you've been explaining yourself is so that the people around you would see you the way you want to be seen, that's not transparency. That's the most exposed kind of need. And the uncomfortable thing, the thing this video is going to leave sitting in you, is not a strategy for when to explain and when to stay silent. It's a question about what you've been really asking for all along, every time you opened your mouth to justify yourself. And whether, if you're honest, the answer has anything to do with them at all.